Alex, Chen, Georgie, Linu, and all the office bearers who invited me here today. Thank you very much. This is a very special honor to address this group. I'm going to move there, right, to be able to see the slides. I visited the church a year ago and also attended the Harvest Festival. And I was really struck by the amazing enthusiasm and the spiritual fervor of this congregation, including the skills in auctioneering. There are some very persuasive auctioneer leaders in the church, and I was persuaded to buy a one-year supply of cashew nuts, and happily run out of it now. But this is all for giving, and I think that connects us directly with the topic of today, about giving, including everybody in our well-being and making our progress in that way more sustainable. Why the topic of inclusion and poverty? I guess one or two reasons that come to mind right away. One is when you look at all the discussions around the world and ask people what are the top concerns. Inequality. People are okay to better their lives, but the inequality stares in our face. And so you see even protests in the streets, the Paris riots right now, the Brexit in UK. So in 1969 we had the riots in Malaysia, and the Thai farmers and the rubber farmers also protesting. All of them signal that economic prosperity is one thing, but inequality does affect us in a very negative way. The other thing that hit me, and this really was a revelation to me after so many years last night, that in pursuing economics, now teaching at the National University of Singapore, improving economic growth is taken as a mantra. And there is not much discussion of distribution, although people don't mind that, but it is not a primary goal. But then when you turn to the Bible, and we'll come to that in the talk in a few minutes, especially to stimulate a discussion from the group, is there a direct conflict between what economics and economic policy tells us and what the Bible tells us? And if it is so clearly in conflict or different, how do you reconcile it? Last night I was not able to reconcile this at the high level, but at the personal, human, family level, I think the kind of things this church is doing is probably part of the answer. So with that, we have a fairly short talk. Originally it was supposed to be an hour and a half, and I suggested that after our service and many other things that you all have to do, we keep the whole thing to an hour, right? And then I would take up probably no more than 45 minutes. Then I hope we'll have some time for an exchange. Talking about keeping the talk brief, I was reminded of a friend of mine who recently went to Japan, and he told the story that the Japanese host invited him to speak to the audience, and he said, "Oh, no, I cannot, I don't speak Japanese." So I said, "Oh, there's no problem, very simple, you just bow to the left, bow to the center, and bow to the right, and you'll be fine." "Oh, I can do that." So he went ahead and bowed to the left, bowed to the center, and bowed to the right. And the crowd was so happy, clapped, and audience was elated. So he said, "Wow, this went so well, so let me just do it one more time." Again, he bowed to the left, bowed to the middle, and bowed to the right. This time it didn't work. Tomatoes, woo, and the whole place burst into a protest. So he was really shaken up, and he asked the host, "Wow, it went so well. What happened the second time?" So he said, "Well, I'm sorry, but they hate long speeches." So we're going to keep this simple and short. And the two parts of the discussion is, one is the economics that I touched on, and the second is the biblical side. And let's see if the two sides coincide, because after all, the economics really dominates the daily life in terms of the policy, and the biblical messages dominate our spiritual life, and certainly we share that while we are at church and in our daily lives. So the socio-economics of deprivation simply is a story about poverty. You see a number there, about 700 million people. 700 million people live in poverty today, and that number has come down from 1.5 million only some 20 to 30 years ago. So there has been a remarkable progress. But remember, this is income poverty, defined as what people need to survive. That is basically 2,000 calories and a roof over their shoulders. And so that is the generally accepted way of looking at income poverty. However, right away we see, well, there's more to it than that. Are the poor even more hurt in terms of health and education because they have to stand in longer lines to get medical care? Just because if you add that to the income difference, the distribution or the difference in income and health education, that's that much greater. So the common understanding of inequality probably understates how serious the situation is. And then you add to that, well, how about happiness? Okay, you have income, then you add to that education and health, and maybe you can add the environment that you live in and so on, crime and violence, and then at the end of it, are you happy? Well, there are some troubling data on that. People live longer lives, that is true. Japan has the longest life expectancy. Singapore has the second longest life expectancy in the world. And then they came up with a measure of happiness. So we can discuss what does that mean. It's 5 things put together, including spiritual well-being, as people tell about that. But in that measure, Singapore is 25 and Japan is 50. And many of the East Asian economies are pretty low, while on the life expectancy, they're very high. So everything that the economists are telling us to do so that we can live longer lives, at least by this measure, don't seem to translate into happiness. So that's the second bullet there. Should we not worry about that too? And then let's take up more in detail in a few minutes, but the real question is the biblical understanding of poverty different from the first 2 bullets? And that is where we have some very, very fascinating sayings from the Bible which put the focus on the spiritual well-being and less on the worldly possessions. So we will turn to that in a minute. In the world of the economic well-being side, people are increasingly accepting that income alone is not enough. So the protests that I mentioned that are taking place right now around the world are a manifestation that inequality, the second bullet, really underlies a lot of the economic and social ills. So something needs to be done to make this less of an issue. Why is inequality, the rich getting richer and the poor getting not necessarily poorer in Singapore, but in many places? Why is that happening? Is it related to the fact that we have globalization, which puts a high premium on skills, and those who don't have the skills get further and further behind? But in any case, the long and the short of it is that we need to look beyond income. We need to look beyond income and see how we can bring in the biblical understanding of true well-being, and can we marry the two? So that would be probably the theme of our talk today. In getting to that, before I am negative on the economists, because I'm an economist, let me say that a lot of progress has been made to put the focus on some things that really matter. Not only income, income is always there, but a few other things. So a couple of examples on that. One is education. So we all agree that access to schooling is critical. It's a human right. India, for a long time, was the only democracy in the world that did not have universal primary education for a democracy. That is almost history. Almost 100% of the students, of children go to school today. So that is progress. But this slide is saying something different. Just going to school actually is not the story. It is really the quality of education. So, and obviously we have a whole discussion of what do we mean by that. Is it dropouts? Is it completion rates? Is it learning? Is it outcomes? But here, using one indicator of the scores, which is also a partial indicator, you see that Korea and Singapore are world champions when it comes. The top two, Korea, Singapore, and Japan are the top ones. And this sort of focus on the quality of education also gives rise to books like The Tiger Mom, that was written by Amy Chua, that you drive to achieve excellence in this way and you are better off. And we can debate the validity of such a pursuit of quality, even though we can agree that quality is as important as the quantity. Then to take the second one, aside from education, it's the health, of course. So we are just taking up two of the very fundamental aspects of human lives. So in the case of health, India stands out, and in this particular case, not positively. For a country of middle income status at the moment, just going from low income to middle income, India's indicators on health are really comparable, especially in the middle belt. So the dark colored Madhya Pradesh, or as well as Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc. You have very low indicators of health. This picture may be a little bit difficult to read from there. We'll share the slides later, right? So it's about children stunting. And you can see that the well-being of children under age 5 in India are comparable to countries with much lower income levels. And if you had another picture, I would have suggested that it is connected to many other things, including water and sanitation, which mirror this picture exactly. So the water and sanitation situation exactly in Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, etc. are comparable to countries at very, very low income. So beyond income, how do we address education? How do we address health? These come to mind clearly as big ticket items. Okay, and then let me add one more in saying that income is not enough. There needs to be also some safety nets. So we talked about the life expectancy in Singapore and Japan. So the so-called dependency ratio is very high in some of these East Asian countries. More and more people who are not fully working. In Singapore, of course, the elderly work much more than in any other place. Nevertheless, are supported by a smaller working population. So that gives an imbalance, and how do you address that? So social safety nets is one of the things, meaning you provide. People have contributed all their lives, you provide for them, period, no discussion. But how do you do that? But the interesting thing is, in this picture you see that those countries that have provided in that way with social safety nets, they also achieve much better economic outcomes. In other words, two good things go together. And what is more, there is a little story below that, we may not get into that in any detail. There are programs around the world, and that one that is highlighted is called Bolsa Familia. It's a program in Brazil. I happen to have personal knowledge of it. In the 2000s, early 2000s, we lived in Brazil, and they had such a program in the works, but in discussions, the World Bank and others supported the government in coming up with something that addresses the needs of 15 million families, so multiplied by about 4. So you can see it's a huge program where people are given transfers of money. Now, oh, that's a handout. Isn't that a bad idea? Well, not necessarily. Those handouts were conditional on the children of those families attending clinics, and they had to show the evidence, and attending school, because school enrollment in Brazil in the 2000s was even less than what we said earlier. So now it's almost universal. But isn't that expensive? I mean, how do you do that? 15 million families? Well, it's a matter of perspective. If you go to the shipyard in Singapore, you can see a big ship moving, and suddenly as it passes a huge ship, it looks like a tiny speck. So this amount of money for the low-income people is important for them, but it's a small percentage of the country's total expenditures. It's 0.5%. And the return on that is huge in terms of the people, but also in terms of the society. So social safety net is something that East Asia, this region, is behind. We rely a lot on family connections. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. And so there is really almost an economic and a social argument for strengthening social safety nets, especially as people are living longer, which is supposed to be a good thing. And so there we go. So in that picture, how are things going? This is a general picture of income, but income plus. The reality is that we have worsening income distribution right now. So I hate to give all bad news on this score. One more story, and that'll be the last. People from India have their reputation, sometimes they say, of being pessimistic. So the story is of an Indian optimist and an Indian pessimist. And actually the optimist was even more pessimistic than the pessimist. Anyway, so the pessimist said, well, things are so bad, the economy is really not doing so well, they could not get any worse. And the optimist said, aha, they could. So here, 10% of the top. So it's like line up all the Americans in one straight line. So let's say they go from 1 to 100. The last 10 people standing at the end, 10, they have half of the whole income of the Americans. So that's the disparity. And in the case of India, line up all the 1.1 billion, and you'll see that the last 1%, they have about 70 to 73% of the income. So you can see the imbalance. Is that sustainable? Well, I mean, it is some issue, right? I mean, people may not live with that kind of a reality. What about Singapore, where we live? It's an interesting case. When you go around Singapore, you can see the various localities and so on. Income differences don't strike you as much as they strike in India. And one thing is that Singapore has inequality, but not poverty as India has. So it's not as glaring it doesn't stare you in the face. However, if you care, the income inequality in Singapore is the highest in Asia. So that was an eye-opener. I didn't realize, because you don't see that, you don't feel that, right? Do you? I mean, inequality is not the first thing you think about. So if it is under the table, not in the pejorative way, but hidden, does it matter? Well, one thing is, some people say that the inequality in Singapore is not so bad. It's actually overstated. Why? Because it's a city-state. So you can't compare it with India, and it's a city. Compare it with New York, compare it with Paris, and so on. Then it's not such a bad picture. The other thing people say, well, in the income distribution calculations, they include expatriates who are quite wealthy, but including them makes the whole thing look even more distorted than really it should be. But then some others said, no, that may be true, but on the other hand, you don't include the workers who work, but they are at the lower end of the spectrum, but they are not included in the Singapore distribution. So the real inequality, inclusive of the workers, is actually worse. So the debate goes on. Let's say both are right, and it comes out in a wash. Singapore's inequality is still very, very high. And and probably among the highest in Asia. So that's the story of inequality without poverty. Well, there's poverty, but not without very, very high degree of poverty. What would be an example of poverty without inequality? That would be, some people would say Venezuela or former Soviet Union. There isn't so much difference of income, but there's a lot of poverty. So you can have the two different phenomena, the Singapore end and the Venezuela end of the story. Okay. So this is kind of a quick overview of the economic side of things, which is about driving the economic policies, the finance ministers and the planning ministers to increase the economic growth rate. And it improves people's well-being. Poverty did decline. However, health, education, many other things do not automatically improve. The social safety net needs to be strengthened. And then, if you include happiness and spiritual well-being, it's a huge question mark. So where do we go? We turn to the Bible. Right? So, the biblical story, only when you put it directly next to the economic story, does bring out some strong points of even contradictions in how the whole thing hangs together. So, to start with, on the poor, the rich and the poor, when we start with the understanding from Matthew 5:3, that blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right away, you can think, what about the rich? So there are some very sharp statements, like it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. So that's Matthew 19:24. So where do we go from there? As the economists push for higher incomes as a way of improving well-being, Bible also reminds us that it is the poor in spirit who really will inherit the kingdom of God. So at the very aggregate level, as I said at the beginning, how the two sides really balance out is a question mark in my mind. But at the personal and the family level, one thing is to take note of a couple of other statements in the Bible. One is, with man it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. The other is, love the Lord with all your heart and soul and might, from Deuteronomy actually. So when you put that together, you can improve your economic well-being and not be succumbed by it, not worship it, but in fact go the other extreme of saying that sharing it with others is part of why I'm driving for higher excellence and driving for higher incomes. That would be, at the personal level, one way of bringing true happiness and true spiritual uplifting, even as you do not deny that income growth can help the society as a whole to improve. When it doesn't happen, that is what the first statement, blessed are the poor in spirit. That means you are not poor in spirit, would mean that you are not humble, and you do not need God, and you have therefore craving for those economic uplifting that the economists have supported. So that, I think, is what is being eschewed in that statement as a way of both pursuing your economic activities, but doing it in a way that you are not a slave to that. Then, how do you make a call to those who are improving their economic well-being and are getting richer in how they might behave to make this conflict more palatable? One, here it says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? So the story of Lazarus, and the rich person at the gate does not even recognize that at the gate there is a person in need. How can that person even begin to do the sharing? So just sharing and recognizing that there are people in need in your very neighborhood would be a call to the rich. Going further, the Bible also has powerful statements on how one might implement this idea of thinking about improving oneself, but with a view to improving or supporting or helping the others. How do you do this? So, first of all, on the meaning of caring itself, I thought this was a very, very strong, powerful statement. The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." In a way, I don't know if Abraham Lincoln was thinking of this, but it is reminiscent of something he said, actually quoting Euclid 2,000 years ago. And the statement literally was, if things which are equal to the same things are equal to each other. Translated, if Joe and Susan are the same, literally, to God, then Joe and Susan must be equal to each other. That's the part we don't often see, even when you say that God considers everyone the same. But if that's the case, the two must be the same too. So it's a mathematical identity almost, that equality is something that we take to heart in this pursuit of caring for the others. Then the second one of how one might care for the less advantaged. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. That's from Leviticus. Now here, one can think, well, are you just saying leave the crumbs for the poor and the downtrodden? If you think about the agriculture, the ones at the edge are closer to the marketplace, and sometimes they are the most productive land. So that does not follow. In fact, a few things that differentiate the quality of your giving from just giving away what you don't need also come to mind. One is you treat the other person as yourself, and then you automatically give that person a second chance. If you're yourself, you always give ourselves a second chance. That's almost by definition we do that. But would we do the same thing for the other person? So giving to the other is not something less than what you need, but you do the same thing for the other. The other would be, in any situation, we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, right? I mean, we say, okay, this is what I really meant. But give the other person the benefit of the doubt. It might be quite easy to do that, actually. Just do the same thing for the other that you do for yourself. So do not go with the false narrative on the other person, but go with what might be equivalent to giving them a second chance and the benefit of the doubt. So this statement about how you give is probably much more powerful than at first sight in terms of really giving quality, give just like you would give yourself to the other person. But then, Old Testament, yeah, how does it apply to the modern day? Is it really something that we can practice? So, three things I mentioned here. We talked a bit about education and health, basic human rights, so they are really high up on the scale of things. And the fact that if Christianity differentiates itself in a good way in terms of giving, it is to give to us fellow human beings generously. What is the nature of that giving in the modern day? So, It's the financial resources, sure. It's a lot of the giving, and a big part of the giving would be what we can bring, because that is the one thing that differentiates the haves and the have-not. But people are busier than ever. They're chasing many things, and rightly so. We cannot deny the importance of what people are doing. So in that setting, as important as the financial side would be the time and the attention and the quality of that giving. What would be some examples? If you give a listening ear for an hour, would there not be many instances where that would be as important and sometimes more important than the dollars you can give to that person? There are many stories, and we won't get into them now, where an hour of one's time has saved a person's spiritual and physical lives on earth. The other would be giving encouragement to people, supporting the youth as well as the elderly, through counseling, coaching, just supporting. And there are numerous ways that people can get involved, which is just as important from the point of view of surveys that have asked people who are the receiving end what mattered to them. So the statement here, the most precious gift you can give to someone is the gift of your time and attention, may resonate very strongly in today's world, where you could be sharing both the wealth and the wealth of your experience. Now, in all of this, then the question comes up, well, what is so distinct about this when it comes to biblical teaching? Isn't that what any human being should be doing? And that's a fair question. In a way, if you listen to Jesus' teachings, that is what he's saying, that it isn't so much to differentiate Christians giving versus some other religions giving, but it is simply that we all take to heart these lessons. But three things hit me, and we are getting fairly to the closing of this. Three things hit me as perhaps distinguishing what a church like this and other churches could be doing. And one is giving voice to the voiceless. I think we are uniquely positioned to give a helping hand for that. The other is including the time that you can give, share widely and give generously. That is something the Bible can do. And then coming back to the purpose of today's lecture, the proactive leadership of everyone, not just the leaders, would be the third one. On giving voice to the voiceless, I believe that this is one of the strongest things that the church is uniquely positioned to help with. In this statement from Proverbs, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. You see examples of that, and often you are frustrated that with those wonderful efforts, you still are not able to fully give voice to the voiceless. But community activists lobbying the government on behalf of psychologically disadvantaged people with mental illnesses who do not have the voice or a place at the table at the right time is a huge contribution. And you would wish we could triple, multiply that type of help. Or TV channels sometimes, advertising, publicizing, and speaking on behalf of the plight of minorities like the Rohingyas in Myanmar. Or the United Nations recently came up with a book on biodiversity. It's an eye-opener. Every day we're losing thousands and thousands of species because of greed. Or the scourge of plastic waste in Southeast Asia. It's unthinkable how much damage that is causing. So these are all issues where there is no voice. There is no person at the table to make a case. The church is uniquely positioned to take that mantle, giving generously. The wherewithal for that and the whole spiritual support for that the church has needs to be harnessed. And now we come to the father of this lecture series. His Grace, the Most Reverend Dr. Alexander Mark Thoma, Metropolitan, he was an example of how to live those two things that I just mentioned, both in terms of time and in terms of the sheer amount that he did. So the proactive leadership, it wasn't as though this is something he alone would do, but he did it with others. Most vividly, I think, in the case of helping community projects, and most vividly in terms of helping particularly programs for the youth. His life is known. I think a wonderful introduction was given. I might just only add that he was the principal of the Tiruvalla College in at the beginning, 1952, I think. And then he had taken a PhD in theology on the topic of fascinating Vishwarupa Darshana, so global vision, and the vision of God as seen in Bhagavad Gita. So that was his PhD thesis. And he got the attention of the country, and Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister at that time, said, look at that khadi-wearing bishop with a research interest in Gita. Kerala Christians are an amazing lot, and this man truly looks amazing. So that universal global vision, equality across everybody, and yet pulling together the strength of the church to deliver, and deliver in real time with an extraordinary drive and zeal and enthusiasm. This is a life that is really worth celebrating, as we are doing so today. In 1976, he became Metropolitan, and then later he was the first Valyadirimeni. So that's why we gather together, and I salute the church for keeping this tradition. It's an absolutely wonderful tradition, and to take up topics of social and human interest on which the church has a special role. So with that, to close, what do I do? On the very big picture of squaring the economics and squaring the biblical teaching, Achan may have something to say further, but I say that at the human, individual, family level, the two things can be reconciled, and you have the advice and the guidance directly from the Bible. This church seems to be practicing some of that right here. So a very wonderful church with 350 families, 10 families involved in food aid. There's a legal clinic, 2 legal clinics, lawyers who give advice. There is marriage aid, medical mission, and I think a very special migrant workers outreach program, which gets very good feedback from the visitors in terms of what it means to them. So, so the first example is right here, right in front of us, and I think all I can say is more and continue the wonderful work that is being done. And if you go around the world, there are a lot of examples, small and big. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is an example of helping people everywhere to lead healthy lives. So the focus is on health, one of the 2 things we flagged earlier. And then another example from Asia would be the BRAC, the Bangladesh NGO, again involved heavily in the area of health. So at the very global level, the organizations like the World Bank that I used to work with, NGOs, and our church, they all can work together in their respective spheres and make a difference. And with that, we come to the closing where we recognize in a good way that each of our contribution is precious. So you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people's light a lamp, do they put it under a basket, but on a stand, and gives light to all in the house. So in the same way, the exhortation is, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Matthew 5:13-16. And with that, I thank you all for your attention. Congratulations on the work you're doing. It's a wonderful parish, and thank you, Atan, for having me here today, and wish you the very best, and all the way to the next year's event that we will have around this time. Thank you, and best wishes.